Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're looking at Qatar, almost 1 year to the day since the new Emir took over from his father. With us to talk about it from Abu Dhabi, Faisal Al-Yafai, journalist for Abu Dhabi newspaper The National. Welcome back as well to Olivier Dallage, sister station Radio France International, and the co-author of the book. Tell us the title in French here.
The new masters of the game. Sorry.
The new masters of the game. What is the game?
Well, the political game, the diplomatic game. Who is calling the shots?
Who's calling the shots? Okay, and we're also with us Ardavan Amir Aslani, a lawyer and political analyst. Thank you for being back with us. Tiny Qatar's presence felt the world over, thanks to satellite television station Al Jazeera, the sentencing in Cairo this Monday to 7 years in prison of 3 journalists from Al Jazeera English, sparking worldwide condemnation. They were convicted of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been declared a terrorist organization inside of Egypt. What was interesting, Olivier Dallage, when we spoke to our correspondent in Cairo earlier, he said inside of Egypt, this verdict is very popular among a lot of people.
Yes, but I think that inside of Egypt at the moment, there are a lot of things which are going wrong. I mean, there has been a military coup d'etat. The politics is very polarized. It was so at the time when Morsi was the president. It has been so since then. You know, the Romans used to say, "Vae victis," that is, those who lost, too bad for them. And this is the feeling. I mean, all those who were supporting Morsi strongly or even less strongly, now they're the victims of the repression. So a few journalists, Al Jazeera, of course, notoriously, because Al Jazeera is the mouthpiece of Qatar, and whatever those people have said, done, matters very little. What matters is that they worked for Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera is seen as the mouthpiece of Qatar, which was supporting the Muslim Brothers. That's it.
Do you agree this is victor's justice that we've witnessed this Monday in Cairo?
Of course, and Olivier Dallage is perfectly right, and what is happening in Egypt today is a tragedy. I mean, you may or you may not appreciate Qatar's support for the Muslim Brotherhood, but at the end of the day, one thing which is certain, and although this term was not utilized neither by the French government nor by the American government, a coup d'etat occurred in that country. A coup d'etat occurred and toppled the only democratically elected government in the entire 4,000-year-old Egyptian history. And now what we're seeing today is a backlash against all those who were supporters or cronies of the previous regime. That's what we're witnessing.
We can now welcome from London, and London traffic could not keep him away, Omar Ashur, Senior Lecturer of Security Studies at the University of Exeter, non-resident fellow at the Brookings Doha Center. Welcome, and welcome back to the France 24 debate. When you see this backlash against Al Jazeera and what it represents to Egyptians, what are your thoughts?
I think it's a deterioration to unprecedented levels. I mean, Mubarak era looked like much less repressive now. Never in Egypt history you saw, you know, 600 and over 680 people getting a death sentence, and then 529 before them. And then now you're having journalists, professional journalists who are mainly doing their job, you know, getting these kind of 10-year sentence and 7-year sentences, which is unprecedented before. Obviously unprecedented before the levels of repression we saw in 13th of August or 14th of August 2013. In 7 hours, more than 931 people getting gunned down. And this is not a comprehensive survey. This is like 931. This is the ones where you got the ID with their birthplace and with their region and employment status and so on. You know, with this kind of level, it's just shocking. And what happened is part of this wave of unprecedented repression post-July 2013. I think Al Jazeera is also paying a price for its. It was very open in terms of its coverage of January 2011, the uprising that really challenged the status quo. And until today, the idea of having, you know, one person pro, one person anti, and one person in the middle this is not what the regime in Egypt wants to see. It wants to see only the narrative that is supportive of it. But having a narrative that is very critical of it and having the middle way is unacceptable. And Al Jazeera is unfortunately paying a high price for that by taking its journalists hostages, basically, but in a legal and constitutional framework, between quotations.
Faisal Al-Yafai, let me ask you, in the Emirates, how is this seen, this conviction of journalists, basically these three journalists from Al Jazeera, how is it being viewed where you are?
Well, you know that the Emirates, as the Saudis, are very supportive of the new leadership of Egypt. But the idea that you sentence journalists to jail time for doing their job is ridiculous. I mean, this is really beneath the new Egypt that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi should be bringing in. So I'm hoping that in the next few weeks during Ramadan that there'll be some sort of amnesty. I mean, the idea that you put journalists in cages and then you sentence them to jail, this is really, really ridiculous. This is not what Egypt needs at a point when the world is looking at Egypt to have a transition so that more investment can be brought in, so that there can be legitimate changes, changes that will help the economy. This isn't what the world needs to see.
And we're seeing, Faisal, part of this, of course, in the case of Egypt, is a backlash against the Muslim Brotherhood, the view that Qatar is supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. Why isn't there the same backlash against, say, Turkey, which is also, whose ruling party is part of the International Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, the Qataris were very supportive of the Brotherhood in general, and I think that they underestimated quite how bad the Brotherhood was in a variety of countries. In particular, in the Emirates, of course, there was a Brotherhood cell, Islah, which was sentenced to jail time and uncovered. It was this sort of thing that the GCC really didn't like. They were very angry that the Qataris seemed to think that they could play politics with the Brotherhood. Now, it's a legitimate thing for the Qataris to seek alliances as a small country, but the Brotherhood was really destabilizing the Arab world's largest country, and the GCC always worry that any problems in these countries are going to reach its shores, and the stability of the Arab world really hinges to a large degree on what happens in Egypt. So I think when you had the Qataris pouring money and resources into Egypt, into the government of Mohammed Morsi, the rest of the GCC started to wonder whether they understood fully what they were backing.
All right, that resentment of Qatar's soft power expressed openly by Iraq's embattled Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki.
All of you have seen how the media, which, backed by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, describe the militants as revolutionaries, but call the Iraqi army a sectarian army, ignoring that they themselves are living in a country practicing marginalizing sectarian policies.
Omar Ashur, your thoughts on those remarks, which we've heard a lot of in the last few days, both in Baghdad and in Tehran.
I think we need to disaggregate things a bit. Qatar emerged since mid-90s, since around 1995, with the new leadership as what you can call a status quo challenger. The leadership chose or perceived the status quo in the Arab world as unsustainable and as repressive and as corrupt. And from 1996, when Al Jazeera was established, it was a revolution in the Arab world. It's things that we take here in Europe for granted, but for the first time, the regimes, the heads of the regimes, the opposition figures, being given a voice and being freely criticizing what seemed to be what for a long time was a taboo in the Arab world, and that progressed. The Big Bang again happened in 2011. But just before 2011, you had Qatar sponsoring mainly the status quo challengers, the figures, the activists, the organizations who were critical of the regimes. This is from the very far left, from the socialist revolutionaries, all the way to the very far right, including figures, for example, the Arab Foundations for Democracy that was established by Dr. Saadi Ibrahim, one of the liberal activists, had its based in Doha. In 2011, it basically, you can say that the foreign policy was behind most of the uprisings, seeing it as popular uprisings.
But, Omar, hang on 1 second. Omar, of course, the name that's most associated with Al Jazeera, well, the one quote-unquote star of its channel is the cleric Youssef al-Qaradawi. I remember covering one Arab League summit where Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak didn't come because he was furious at the hosts in Doha because of what Qaradawi said in his televised speeches.
Yeah, well, this is what I'm coming at. The pro-change forces, the support of the uprisings happened against allies or friends and foes. So Mubarak was obviously, they had disagreements with the Qatari leadership. But it was, the Al Jazeera covered what was happening in Tahrir. And to a certain degree, there was some kind of support for what's happening in Tahrir. Even many were saying, Facebook, Twitter, and Al Jazeera were the main sponsors of the Egyptian revolution. And it happened as well in Tunisia. But Qatar had good relations with Bashar regime, for example, prior to the revolution, and had good relations with the Libyan, with Gaddafi's regime prior to the revolution. But when the uprisings happened, it sponsored or it supported in both cases with some of the GCC countries, with countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And in that dynamic, this is when the regional dimension emerged quite significantly, because Bashar is obviously an ally of Iran. And the sectarian issue became emerging more and more evidently in Iraq. So what you see now is multiple coalitions, a coalition that is mainly Saudi Arabia and with other partners, the UAE and with other partners, that perceive the status quo as beneficial. So keep everything as it is, except in the Syrian case, because the regime is in alliance with Iran, which is the head of the second coalition. And you have Turkey and Qatar, and to a certain degree Tunisia, mainly seeing the status quo as unsustainable, and the status quo in the region needs to be changed. And therefore, for a while, we're promoting anti-status quo agents, if you wish, or actors.
All right, we saw,
but from different ideological backgrounds. This is what I'm trying to say. And it happened that the winners from these changes in places like Egypt and Tunisia were the Islamists. But in Libya, for example, the winners in the elections were not the Islamists. And you have some of the anti-Islamist satellite channels are being funded and are based in Doha, in Qatar.
All right. Olivier Daraj, your thoughts on this?
I think a very important point was just made, that before the Arab Spring, Qatar had good relations with both Bashar al-Assad and Gaddafi, which means that as opposed to what a lot of people believe, the agenda of Qatar is not so much ideological, it may be, but it is rather opportunistic. They thought they could change the course of history. And then, of course, they would support those who were close to them, meaning the Muslim Brotherhood or whatever movement close to Muslim Brotherhood. Another point, the question was asked, what is the difference between Turkey and Qatar? Why doesn't Turkey undergo the same kind of bashing we have with Qatar? Well, there is a difference in size and history, and obviously it's easier to do Qatar bashing than Turkey bashing.
Ardavan?
No, I think both are just as easy. But we need to understand also that what we're talking about Qatar, in numbers. Qatar, you mentioned 350,000. I thought it was even less than that. Even if it's 350,000, it's a Wahhabi system, so the women don't count. So put half of them on the other side. This leaves around 75,000. Associate the elderly, associate the young people. This leaves a country of 60,000 people and less. That's what Qatar is. And it was waving and wagering out disproportionate, if I dare say, power internationally with its wallet diplomacy.
And on this Monday, that influential cleric we mentioned, Youssef al-Qaradawi, staging a press conference in Doha where he called for a toning down of things, of bridging the divide between Sunnis and Shias.
Well, it's not about Sunnis and Shias. This, as what we're witnessing today in Iraq and Syria demonstrate. There are Sunnis in Iraq that despise the Takfir version, the Wahhabi version that is personified by the ISIL movement. You have moderate Sunnis. Not all Sunnis are fanatics, thank God. What we are seeing in Syria, what we're seeing in Iraq, is a specific version of Islam, which derives from the Wahhabi version of fundamentalist Islam called Takfir, and the French public and international public needs to get accustomed to this notion, which basically considers all those who do not adhere to the strictest version of Islam are considered to be, basically infidels and, authorized to be put to death. This is what is creating and raising havoc in Iraq. And you can't say today that whether it's their government or it's their people or this and that, where does the financing for these armies of 50,000 people that, walk across the Syria-Iraqi border come from? It is not individuals, millions made by rich, as our friend in Abu Dhabi pointed out. And I wanted to know, where do the millions come from, bearing in mind that the population of the UAE, and Qatar and Kuwait doesn't even make 2 million.
And that was the point we were getting to just before the break when we had technical issues. Faisal Yafa, your thoughts?
Well, Erdogan is creating a soup of different ideas. The Qataris are not a Wahhabi state. The Takfiris do exist. It's certainly the case in Iraq and in Syria. The idea that these are being funded by Gulf governments is ridiculous. I don't know where really to begin unpacking this this soup of barely understood notions. Let's try and get some sense into the conversation about where Qatar is. Qatar is a state. It is a state within the GCC, and it has no interest in either destabilizing the GCC or in destabilizing the wider region. What they are seeking to do is to have greater soft power, greater alliances. Now, you saw that most clearly recently with the negotiations over the release of the American hostage Bo Bergdahl, where as the cost of him being returned to the US, you have the Taliban in Qatar. So the Qataris, of course, have the largest base, the largest US base in the region, and they look both ways on this. They are a good place for both sides to come together and try and hash out their differences. That was one of the reasons why the Taliban opened their office in Qatar. So I think if you start to see it as a military conflict between the Qataris and the Emiratis and the Saudis, then you get very confused over what's going on. There has been a difference of opinion between the Saudis and the Qataris over the best way forward in Syria about who to arm and how to end it. But they both agree on the same thing. They both agree that the regime of Assad has to be brought to a conclusion.
Olivier Delage.
I think also that there is much more, they're much more in agreement that meets the eye. We're talking about rivalry which date back to, centuries. I wouldn't say tribal rivalries because that would be a bit derogatory, but there is certainly competition within the dynasties, and it's not just disagreements over political issues. Of course, there are political issues. The other thing is that, yes, Qatar is at odds with another 3 members of the GCC, but notably 2 other members just keep quiet, meaning Oman and Kuwait, which means that Qatar is not so isolated inside the GCC. It's not as simple as a lot of people try to say.
Omar Ashur, that brings us back to the events of exactly 1 year ago. Why was there a change of Emir?
Just before that, I wanted to give some numbers because the previous Emir had some serious accomplishments and brings us back to what Faisal has mentioned and what your other honorable guest has mentioned, the issue of putting Qatar on the top of the Human Development Index in the Arab world. This is a country where its Human Development Index is 0.83, 36 in the world. This is a country that is at the top of the world in terms of per capita income, 103,000 per capita. So we're looking at quite a different internal dynamics and internal achievements for the leadership before it departs. So this is a leadership that on one side had a, relatively speaking, a reformist or even a revolutionary foreign policy. Internally, it had some serious economic achievements and, compared to pre-1995. And then for the first time in this region, abandoning to its heir apparent, which, as far as I remember, did not happen before at least in the GCC countries. So with this kind of dynamic, it left a certain legacy and had certain, repercussions and impacts in the area, mainly because of these interesting combinations of things. Internal achievements, revolutionary foreign policy, and then
but that's not
abdication
how the story,
in a sense.
That's not how the story was spun a year ago. It was seen as though the Emir was being shown the door almost.
By who?
That we were talking a year ago about how there were internal discussions and a lot of internal struggles within among the Qataris over which direction to go? Had they boxed above their weight category in this sort of thing? Olivier Daraj.
Yes, that is history of Qatar, and the history of Qatar leadership is made of family coup d'etat, including himself. I mean, Sheikh Hamad toppled his father. No, I think the reason, there may be health problems, but I'm not sure this is the main reason. The main reason, I think, is that Sheikh Hamad has achieved a lot by challenging everyone. Now, his son, the heir apparent, I mean, becoming the new Emir after his death, would have been challenged by his uncle, the prime minister, by a lot of other people. So by stepping down and staying in the back and pushing his son while he's still there, I mean, he is just managing his own legacy. And I think that was the idea.
Faisal Al-Yafai, your thoughts?
Well, I'm not entirely clear on the internal dynamics of Qatar. I mean, I should point out that it isn't unusual to have neighboring countries as rivals. You'll remember, since we were talking about the fighter jets being sold to the Gulf state, the British also tried to sell the fighter jets to the Emirates, as did the French, and there was a lot of bargaining over which side would manage to get the sale. So these sort of rivalries are not unusual. They are part and parcel of foreign policies, even in countries which are really brotherly neighbors. Now, what Dr. Ashur has pointed out is absolutely right. The Qataris have come a long way, not merely since 1995, but since 2005. I mean, it's been an astonishing transformation, and that has caused differences within the GCC. I mean, it's natural that there's going to be some sort of jockeying for position. I think that the point that the GCC, particularly the Saudis and the Emiratis, wanted to make when they withdrew their ambassadors was that it is perfectly reasonable for the Qataris to have a separate foreign policy in some respects, but it is not reasonable for that to be done at the expense of the other GCC countries. It cannot be that they are destabilizing, that they are supporting movements that are seeking to destabilize countries like the UAE, while at the same time remaining part of the wider family.
Ardavan.
Just one comment over here in relation to who finances whom. And this is interesting. Our friend sitting in Abu Dhabi considers that the petro-dollar Arab monarchies of the Persian Gulf don't finance anybody, and they're absolute democracies and examples upon humanity.
That's not what he said.
That being said, it is surprising that the Prime Minister of Iraq specifically names Qatar and Saudi Arabia as a financier. So Assad presents them as a financier. The United States is sending delegations asking these people to reduce their financing into these terrorist movements into Syria and Iraq. So we should not forget that. And the reason, and you're so right in pointing it out, that the current Emir's father was invited to leave is because of that, because the entire Qatari foreign policy in the Arab Spring totally flunked out. Look at the result of their involvement in Libya. Do you think Libya is a success? Look at Syria and Iraq. Are those successes? Look at the disintegration of Tunisia.
But these
and look
are
what
not,
happened to
but it's
Egypt.
Not, but what's happening in Syria is not because of Qatar.
No.
Se.
I mean, these in Syria, as in Iraq, these are sectarian wars between today Shia governments that are being opposed by a certain version of Islam, and despite what Al-Yafai, our friend, is saying, Qatar is Wahhabi and so is Saudi Arabia, and they're defending these people.
We're almost out of time. I don't want to go back over ground we've been over. We're not going to get away with not asking this question during the World Cup. Should Qatar be hosting the World Cup in 2022? I'll start with you, Faisal Al-Yafai.
Oh, well, let's see what the outcome of the investigation is. I mean, I think they have as much right to host the World Cup as anybody else.
And do you agree with that, Olivier Daraj?
I have no opinion on that, but what I want to point out is that World Cup was part of that soft power strategy, and it just shows that because of the screening of what's happening in Qatar, because of this very World Cup, it comes back as a boomerang on Qatar leadership, and it gives food for thought on what to achieve with soft power.
All right, very briefly, Omar Ashur.
Let's wait for the end of the investigation. But I think if they were able to host it in the end, I think it will be another achievement to put it.
Ardavan?
I'm not a soccer fan, but I noticed two facts. They're being accused of corruption, number one. And number two, I want a thought over here for 1,000 plus immigrants, workers on the stadiums who've died working under 50 degrees centigrade in summer and elsewhere. A thought for them.
All right, and it's obviously an issue that we'll come back to. I want to thank our panel. I want to thank Ardavan Amir Aslani, Omar Ashur for joining us from London, Faisal Al-Yafai, always a pleasure to have you from Abu Dhabi, and Olivier Darage from sister station Radio France International. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.